Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this special edition of the Liberia History Channel on Focus on Liberia. My name is Dennis Jai, and we are broadcasting from Atlanta, Georgia. In tonight's edition of the Liberia History Channel, we're going to be continuing our topic on debunking the myths, the disinformation, misinformation, falsehoods, and lies in Liberian history. Tonight, as usual, our presenter is Carl Fahnbulleh. Carl, welcome to the show.
It's always my pleasure to be here.
We want to welcome all our viewers from across the globe. The Liberia History Channel. This is the only place where we discuss Liberian history. So, since I've been learning history in Liberia or Liberian history, there have been some things that didn't happen, but they recorded in history. For whatever reason, we're going to look into that tonight, but that's not what I'm introducing. I'm just telling you there are certain things in Liberian history that are just not true. Why and why they continue till this time, we're going to find out. But we are excited to present those things that are not in the Liberian history, that are not true. Last week we were here, we talked about some of the myths. Like, for instance, the ship Elizabeth, the Mayflower, came to Liberia in 1822. We found out from the research presented here by Carl that this is not true. Today, we're going to go into another part. This is part two. So enjoy the show, invite somebody, and let's learn together. This is a journey. We're on a journey, and I'm excited to be part of it. Carl, I think you are also.
Thank you, Dennis. So I just wanted to say that I don't know, I don't really believe that anyone's ever taught in school or anything that the Elizabeth landed at Providence Island. I think that's just something people just think and without, it being formally taught. So that is not, I think it's just sometimes in the society you just make assumptions and those assumptions just continue. But right, the Elizabeth landed at Sherbro, and actually more people remained or were removed to Freetown than on the original Elizabeth, and who actually went on to Providence Island 2 years later. So when it arrived in 1820, many people died. Those who survived, the majority of them actually refused to go on to Cape Meserado, and the majority, including Daniel Cooker, who led the group, went on to Freetown. So there are more Creole descendants of the Elizabeth people than there are Liberian descendants of the people in Elizabeth. That being said, the Elizabeth had Elijah Johnson, who is a significant figure in Liberian history. And probably Liberia would not have been a republic without his presence at Cape Meserado.
Maybe that's why. Maybe that's why we thought it came to Liberia.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It does. I mean, so yeah, the Brig Strong went directly to Liberia. It's the first ship that went directly to Cape Meserado with repatriates on it. It's the third ship actually, and it was a Brig Strong. But there's lots of myths. So what I really wanted to say, I think what's very important to say is that most of these myths or misinformation things that we're covering are just the ones that I find interesting. It certainly does not exhaust all of them. They're just the common ones that I hear a lot. And some of them I think are very dangerous misunderstandings and destructive ones. But we're just going to cover some of these today. We're going to go, into it quickly. And then I would love to hear feedback from people. This is the kind of show where it's best for people to call in, write your comments and things like that. I want it to be very interactive. We can go from there.
Right. And again, our listeners, we encourage you to please call in, send your comments. So some of the misinformation, disinformation, we're going to go through. Some of them, as Carl is saying, they're dangerous, and that's why we want to correct them. But one guy said, don't take my word for it. Call in if you have other information that you want to share to either support this or say, I didn't see it that way. Please call in or write your comments, and we'll be glad to discuss it.
Yes.
So
So let's
uncovering
be.
this
Go ahead,
information in
Sally.
Liberian history. This is part two. And I like this quote. History is a clock that people use to tell their political and cultural time of the day. It is a compass they use to find themselves on the map of human geography. It tells them where they are, but more importantly, what they must be.
Yes, that's Dr. John Henry Clark, famous historian. It's one of my favorite quotes by Dr. Clark. He has many, but this is one of my favorite quotes that he has about history. Dr. Clark is what we call a super scholar. He was a groundbreaking researcher. Um, so we're uncovering more disinformation in Liberian history. This is part two. Please watch part one if you have not already. This photo is of our second president. This is a artist correction of an actual photograph that was taken by Augustus Washington before Stephen Allen Benson became president when he was young. And the image on the right is the image of Stephen Allen Benson on the Liberian currency. He's represented here looking quite different than how he actually looked in real life. He is president number 2. This is also the picture to the right. It's more similar to the pictures of President Benson in our textbooks. So we'll get into why that is important and why this is one of the disinformation things that we need to debunk. So the first thing we're going to do is debunk this myth of the mulatto hegemony. Dennis, what have you heard about the mulatto hegemony in Liberia?
Well, what I've
You're one of
heard,
the most educated Liberians I know. So I want to know what you were taught and what your thoughts were.
right, and what I saw growing up and reading that most of our presidents, the early ones, were mulatto. What today we know as mixed.
Mm-hmm.
And that there was always this rivalry between those that were mixed or mulatto and those that were darker skinned. And that
Yes.
was the tension that existed in those early days.
And that's certainly what I was led to believe early on as well. But there's really not a lot of evidence of it that's any deeper than really superficial. And in fact, I wasn't able to find anything, any writing of President Roberts, or any of the mulattoes where they are asserting themselves as a ruling class or articulating any disdain for people who are not mulatto. I have not seen that. I know that African Americans, and because of white supremacy, this is hierarchy on the human totem pole, where the lighter you are, the closer you are to white, the bad. White is right. If you're black, get back. And they really tried to show favor through this white supremacist narrative to lighter skinned African people. But the fact is, with all of that being said, mulatto people with one white or one European parent, one African parent, were often discriminated against and were enslaved, were subjected to be slaves. And even if you had one, the United States of America is just so sick with this that if you have one drop of black blood, you're considered black, you're considered tainted. So many people who were considered mulatto went to Liberia rejecting this whole thing and say, you know what, like Daniel Coker, who was very, very fair skinned. In fact, Daniel Coker's mother, he was on board Elizabeth. His mother was white. His mother was what we consider to be a poor white sharecropper in those days. So she was just a step above being a slave, but she was white. And she had a child that was also white. Her first son was fully white, probably Irish. And then she had a son by an enslaved man, and that was Daniel Coker. So Daniel Coker's name, Daniel Coker, he actually took from his white brother. But Daniel Coker called himself Daniel Coker, a descendant of Africa. That's what he called himself. And he always insisted that his father was an African. And so he went back to Africa on the Elizabeth, landed at Sherbro, and then decided not to continue with ACS, but went on to Freetown to carry on his mission. And you have Roberts, we've talked about Russell, if you go back to the presidential series. So we had these people. We had Sherman, General Sherman, who was very, very Irish looking. but had one Black or one African grandparent out of the four. So he was about 75% white, but General Sherman married a very Black woman. So this idea that there was some kind of mulatto hegemony and people were segregated on color lines, there's not a lot of evidence of that in Liberia, as opposed to what you might have found in the upper echelons of African American society much later on, after the abolition of slavery. But you have to remember, Liberia was established before the abolition of slavery. So at this point, they had not really allowed this mulatto versus Black uh, uh, um, division to really kick in. And more importantly, the majority of the people in the country were not mulatto. So it would have been very difficult, even if mulatto people had this idea, this false sense of supremacy, to really use it in any meaningful way and empower themselves, because they were greatly outnumbered. The majority of the population of Liberians were very dark skinned.
So in other words, you are saying did this happen or did not happen, but you didn't find any evidence. You didn't find enough
I'm
evidence
saying
to support that.
not anything significant enough to, I have not read anywhere where Joseph Jenkins Roberts or Alfred Russell or anyone, General Sherman or any of these very famous, or the Uri clan that was repatriated that were mulattoes. I've not read anywhere, and they wrote a lot of letters back home. I've not read anywhere where they separated themselves from the darker skinned people in Liberia, where they didn't consider themselves the same as.
Right.
I have not seen them, which is just shocked me, right? Because it's like, oh, they were divided on color lines, and everybody was mulatto. And E.J. Roy, the True Whig Party, was the first time a Black man had any power in Liberia. That's clearly not true. It's not supported by primary sources. Roy himself, E.J. Roy himself, never said, "I'm standing up for dark-skinned people. We're overthrowing the mulatto hegemony." Even the conflict between Roy and Roberts and his Roberts side, well, Roberts and Payne were on one side, and E.J. Roy was on another side. At no time did it ever come up in any of their correspondence, their letters, their speeches, anything about this dark-skinned, light-skinned thing.
So if you look at like party structure or government positions, or even University of Liberia faculty or those that were being admitted in school, we there's no evidence that maybe mulatto people were in of much power or they have more money, affluent, nothing.
Well, no, because the wealthiest people were all over the place. I mean, Roy, of course, was one of the wealthiest Liberians in history, E.J. Roy. He built a ship, the Liberia, and he was, basically, there's not a Black person alive today that has accomplished what E.J. Roy accomplished in the 1800s. We don't have any of these post-Panamax massive cargo ships that are owned by any African person today. But what Roy was doing with his transatlantic commerce in those days was the equivalent of a Black person owning a post-Panamax ship, a gigantic ship carrying tons of cargo. These things are owned by, huge corporations in places like China, of course, the United States, all of these other countries, but there's nowhere in Africa, no African Americans, no continental Africans that own a vessel that conducts that kind of commerce that Roy was conducting. So there were, and he was Black. He was full-blooded African. Same thing with Daniel Bashir Warner, earned his wealth from being a merchant and a trader. He also, President Warner, also owned and constructed ships for coastal commerce, not transatlantic like what E.J. Roy owned, but he owned three ships for coastal commerce. You had the Uris, who were very, very wealthy because they were sent back to Liberia with a significant amount of wealth. And they even were sent back to Liberia with other emancipated servants to serve them, who also carried the name Uri. So this is a lot of, those people were wealthy. General Sherman was wealthy because, again, sometimes the mulattoes would have been repatriated with some wealth because they were at times the biological descendants of the people who owned them. So that didn't actually, but it wasn't only exclusive to them, nor was it exclusive to just, there were very wealthy indigenous people as well, but we'll get into that. And we have gotten into that. We're talking about people like Digbo Twe and Wolo and other, Wolo's wife, very wealthy, trading in minerals. So
how about power? Who
Power.
had the power? Was it mulatto or both?
Again, I didn't see any evidence of there being much distinction between people. The majority of the people were dark skinned. The majority of people that held positions of power were dark skinned. So this is did we already show the go back to the first slide. Okay. So this is okay. Not that, the second slide. Sorry, Dennis. This is a photograph of leadership in Liberia. Most of these men are religious leaders. They are teachers, university instructors, political leaders. And I see about 2 people in this photograph that could potentially be classified as mulatto. Only 2. And they're not standing aside. There's one mulatto guy, he's relatively short. He's kind of standing to the side. You can see him there. And then there's one seated in the center. Everyone else is seated or standing. There's not any, distinction. So we're going to put the mulatto guys in the front and we're all going to stand behind them because they're better than us. There's just nothing here to show that any of that was happening. The next photo, we have Bishop Taylor, who Bishop Taylor was pretty light skinned. I mean, he was pretty darn fair skinned. I mean, this man was whiter than J.J. Roberts. He was probably about as light skinned as President Russell. He's the one seated with the huge beard. Could almost pass for white, but he knew he was a son of Africa, a descendant of Africa, and he went to Liberia willingly. This photograph was taken at the Methodist Conference of 1888 held in Monrovia. You have a few interesting people here. You have Capehart, who went to partly on the trip to Bopru with Benjamin J.K. Anderson. Capehart is the one seated to the very far right of the photo. The man with the lighter coat is standing next to Capehart. He's seated with his arms crossed and his legs crossed there. Okay. Now, Capehart, if you read the narrative of the journey to Musadu or watched our episode on Benjamin J.K. Anderson, you'll know that Capehart was his nemesis. But I just found it interesting that he's here photographed about 20, in fact, not about, exactly 20 years after he took the famous journey to Musadu with Benjamin J.K. Anderson. And there's a whole key here at the bottom to show who all of these people are. But for the sake of time, we won't do that. The purpose of this is just to demonstrate that these are now leaders in the Methodist Church. These men are prominent Liberians, most of them very, very wealthy, successful merchants and farmers. They are not mulatto. I've never seen actually a photograph of leadership in Liberia where the majority of them are mulatto. I've never seen one. And I've been digging through these archives for more than 20 years. So this is not, it's just, I don't know where the story's coming from. I do know where it's coming from. It's coming from 20th century revision, much later on, trying to project things into the past that were not there. Project their modern thinking onto the past that wasn't there. We can go on to the next slide unless you have questions.
Right. The only question I have is, also what we heard is in America, the light skin were home and the darker skin were in the field. And that's the same mentality they took to Liberia because they were home and they were closer to the slave masters. And that's why they felt more important when they went back to Liberia.
It's an oversimplified story, right? Because most of the people that went to Liberia initially that were dark skinned were not born slaves, right? Okay. Most of our first presidents were not born into slavery, right? So the first president we had that was born into slavery was actually a mulatto president. So we had freemen from the Northeast, children of either recaptured Africans or Black freemen that came to Liberia, very dark, especially children of the recaptured Africans, and they were not born into slavery. Joseph Jenkins Roberts' mother was a slave. She was liberated from slavery before he was born, so he was born free. Stephen Allen Benson was born free. You know, the presidents were all born free until up to Russell was the first president that was born into slavery, and he was the lightest skinned president. He had more European ancestry than Roberts. So to say that it was a house Negro versus field Negro thing, I think is projecting a narrative that didn't exist at the time. These black presidents were not born into slavery. We had two presidents that were born into slavery. That was Russell and Coleman. Both of whom went to Liberia as children. Russell was actually the grandson of the wealthiest woman in Kentucky where he was born. His slave, the person who owned him, was the richest woman in Kentucky. And when she, lost her son, who was Russell's biological father, she took Russell and all of his relatives and sent them to Liberia. So the narrative about field Negro versus house Negro is just, it doesn't apply to the Republic of Liberia. It's a lot of times what we do is we take things and we project them onto the past without any evidence. It's worse than reading history backwards. It's taking modern concepts or things that we learn in a different context and projecting it onto people that it doesn't apply to.
Now we have the Supreme Court.
Yeah, we don't have any mulatto people in the Supreme Court in 1907. We have never had a mulatto Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in the history of Liberia. That's one of our three branches. We've had some mulattoes in the legislature, and we've had only two mulatto presidents. So this thing about the mulatto hegemony is just very strange. Very, very strange. And here you have a Supreme Court with an indigenous man who later becomes Chief Justice after, this is, of course, James Jenkins Dosen. And then you've got Zachariah Roberts, who was the Chief Justice. When he died, Dosen takes over as the Chief Justice. I believe Dosen is the first indigenous person to be Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. When I say indigenous, I'm talking about a person belonging to the pre-Republic indigenous people of Liberia. Mm-hmm. So here we go again. We've got Massaquoi, very powerful, rich, descendant of royalty from Cape Mount. He was the Consul General of Germany, one of the most powerful diplomats in Liberian history, and not light skinned at all, not mulatto at all. Very, very vibe, very, very native, very, very dark skinned. And then to the right there, you've got G.W. Gibson. You've got standing with his hand conspicuously in his coat is one of my favorite people of all time, Arthur Barclay of Barbados, born in Barbados, one of the most courageous presidents we've ever had. And then you've got the grandson of either grandson or son. I think he's the grandson of Johnson, Elijah Johnson. And I don't know who these other two men are, but this is G.W. Gibson seated. But again, we don't see any mulattoes, so-called mulattoes in this picture. Again, very powerful, powerful Liberian men. Next photo. Quarterly sessions of Montserrado County, Liberia. Looking at the picture, I see about one mulatto person in the photograph seated to the far left. Everyone else looks pretty black to me. And mulatto people, don't get me wrong, they are black. They are African descendants, and we have mulattoes among the indigenous populations. I'm not saying that they're not, but this is only emphasizing the distortion that it was like the whole country was being controlled by mulattoes, and if you're black, get back. I don't see it. I don't see it. I haven't read it. It's not something that, I see in primary sources. It's something that I start seeing written later on after, especially during the Tubman era. You start seeing it a lot. This is a very modern creation and projection into the past.
And
Go ahead.
by mulatto would mean one of your parents is black. I mean, it's
One of
white.
your parents is European, yes, or
It's
something
European.
other than African.
Right, because you can be both parents and still be light skinned. That's not the mulatto we're talking about. Just to be clear.
Well, being light skinned doesn't mean mulatto. I
Yeah,
mean, you could be a full blooded African and be light skinned. Light skin does not imply, it does not necessarily mean that you have a European ancestor.
because
We've got different degrees of skin tone and pigmentation. Some of it is attributed to albinism. We've got a form of albinism in Liberia and Sierra Leone that's very common, and we in the streets call it Jato, being a Jato, but it is a mild form of albinism. My grandfather had that, my paternal grandfather, where he had red hair and freckles. He wasn't mulatto. He didn't have white ancestry. It was just a genetic malformation. And it's a genetic malformation that's also hereditary, because then it ends up being in your uncles, your cousins, and things like that too. So we know that from just being Native people. But beyond that, mulatto means, and mulatto, one of your parents could be mulatto and your other parent be fully African, and you're not considered mulatto. That's something to point out as well. So, for example, President Sirleaf has a mother, or one German grandparent, and 3 African parents. She's not a mulatto person. She's just a black person. She's just a light-skinned African woman. She and her sister and her brother. So just more pictures of James J. Dosen. You've got the Liberian Senate here. Literally all of these senators are black. If you zoom the picture, that are standing next to the pole, all of them dark. And then you've got James J. Dosen again. I just like his business. I want to put a picture there for the second time. Our Chief Justice, our native Chief Justice.
and Vice President.
Yes, I keep focusing on the Chief Justice because he headed that branch of government, but he served as Vice President under Arthur Barkley as well. And then he ran for president against another native man, which is Daniel Howard, but Daniel won, and then Daniel appointed him as Chief Justice. So this is Honorable C.T.O. King, Grand Master of the Liberian Masonic Order and Judge of Probate Court of Misrepresentation County, Liberia. Now, why am I putting C.T.O. King here? Everybody knows that the most powerful people, those who controlled the ebbs and flow of things and planned the future, sat in the lodge up the hill. And here you have this very black man born in Africa. None of his ancestors ever left the continent of Africa. He was not African American. He didn't come from, he didn't come from Charlotte. He didn't come from Boston. He didn't come from Virginia. His ancestors had never left the continent of Africa. C.T.O. King, the father of Charles D.B. King, very black man, he was the Grand Master. And trust me, there were so-called mulatto people in the Masons, but the Grand Master was a mulatto. He was a black African. One of the most, prominent and vocal ones, right? So you can read this quickly, or we can skip over it for interest of time if you'd like. I just wanted to point this out. We handled his biography quite thoroughly in the Charles D.B. King episode of the History Channel.
Quickly, Judge King was born around 1839, sold into slavery, and repatriated near Freetown around 1848. He attended school from childhood until 1856, when he held various jobs in Freetown. While he was employed as a merchant, he removed to Liberia and at once began to fill positions of honor and trust. He was appointed city magistrate and advanced to Justice of the Peace for Misrepresentation County. He was afterward Marshal of the Supreme Court of the Republic, Clerk of the Court, Postmaster at Monrovia, Collector of Customs, Secretary of the Interior, a member of the Cabinet and Trustee of Liberia College. After serving these important positions, he was elected Mayor of Monrovia in 1884 and re-elected successively until 1890. During this time, he also served as agent of the Colonization Society of the United States. Holding this office until 1892, he was engaged in transplanting Liberian coffee in Brazil, South America, in 1898. Judge King is Grand Master of the Masons in Liberia, being elected 1888.
Yeah. So that's Judge King.
Another myth, Native people were not allowed to attend school. I never heard this one though.
Oh, I hear that all the time.
Okay.
I hear that all the time. I've heard it on your show. I've heard Kalogbo Gunglo say that, they use the weaponized education against us. Why didn't my grandparents go to school? So it's said all the time. In fact, of all the myths, this is the one that is prevailing. Even people who are educated say we were denied education. So it is something that is just almost on autopilot with us. So the Republic, people were we thoroughly covered that people were getting educated on the Grain Coast long before 1822. We had literate people who were you had the King Peters who were educated in Liverpool. So the population on the Grain Coast was familiar with education, was familiar with Christianity, was familiar with Western culture. Let's just get that out of the way first. But as far as the establishment of a settlement is concerned, from the very moment Lot Carey's feet touched the ground at Cape Macerado, his entire purpose for going was to establish schools for recaptured Africans and Native people. That was the entire reason Lot Carey went. It was the entire reason Daniel Coker went, except Daniel Coker went on to Freetown to do the same work. It's the entire reason Elijah Johnson went. So many of these African Americans that were on these early vessels were going as missionaries and teachers. The plan was to open schools. So the essential reason, the motivating factor for much of the repatriation was the goal of educating and Christianizing their brethren, as they put it in their own words, repeatedly. So to say that they were denied education when by the people who went for the specific purpose of bringing literacy and Christianity and civilization in their mind, because in their Western mind, that's what civilization was. This is also part of the cause of some conflict, of course, but to say that they were not there to educate people is a complete false statement. So you can go ahead with the slide. So we skipped over that. Okay, no problem. This is important. I think we should, I don't know if you can see this to read it, but I think this is important to read.
Right. You wanted me to read the previous one? I can.
Okay, sure. I'm just looking at the time factor, but yes, if you.
In September 1822, Lot Carey established a school Native African children for Native African.
School for Native African children.
Yeah. In 1828, he moved the antelope captives behind halfway farms on Stockton Creek. When a new agent sent to replace Carey visited in December of 1828, he was very impressed by the former captives' accomplishments. They have been on their lands but 3 months and have already built themselves a school, comfortable houses, enclosed their lots, and have their cassava, plantain, potatoes growing most luxuriantly. This was written by Richie Randall.
Yeah. So Lot Carey died in an explosion. So he was replaced by Richard Randall, and this is what he met. So, another source saying, yes, this man built a school, all these things were existing. And this settlement was not for African Americans, it was for Native people and recaptured Africans.
Now, let me read this one.
If you can't see it, it's not a big deal. I'll just summarize it. The source is here.
I can see it,
Okay.
I got good eyes. All right, the whole system. All right, I'm trying to. All right, the whole system of schools, which had been suspended by the death of Mr. Holton, was reorganized and in efficient operation this year under the superintendence of Reverend G. McGill. an experienced colored teacher, though its influence was limited by the want of proper books and well-qualified teachers. The schools were all taught by colored people and supported partly from the colonial treasury and partly by subscriptions from the colonists. Two, they were sufficiently numerous to embrace all the children, including those of the natives. All were obliged to attend. The number of children in the six schools was 227, of whom 45 were natives. Most of these were the sons of the principal men of the country and were most of these were the sons of the principal men of the country, and more than half could, at the close of the year, read the New Testament intelligibly and understand the English language nearly as well as the settlers of the same age. Had means been supplied, the number of these native pupils could have been greatly increased. 3. A school was opened in the Ve Nation, that's Vi, 35 miles interior from Cape Mount and 60 or 70 from Masurado, by the Baptist missionaries of the colony. He commenced with 35 scholars and was patronized by the prince and headmen of the nation, who were desirous to have their children clothed and trained to the habits of civilized life. Reverend Mr. Carey's school for native children was supported in part by the Baptist Missionary Society of Richmond. The system of government adopted in 1824 had continued without any material alteration and received the cordial support of the enlightened and influential part of the country, I believe.
Yes. So,
and the sources, the something of Liberia, its geography, climate, soil, and productions.
Yeah. So it's Stockwell. This was published in 1868. G.S. Stockwell. So basically, it just goes again reinforcing this idea that the whole goal here was to spread Christianity, literacy, and Western culture. Was this met with resistance? Clearly it was. And maybe I kind of beat a dead horse here a little bit. I get into Samuel David Ferguson. We don't have to go through all of this, but Ferguson, he was another person who was the father-in-law of J.J. Dosen. His daughter ended up marrying James J. Dosen. Samuel David Ferguson would probably have been classified as a mulatto. But he basically, Bishop Ferguson was a prolific educator. I mean, he built schools in a whole bunch of villages, not only in Maryland, but also in Cape Mount. Bishop Ferguson spread his wings and his desire to carry on this torch of African American mission work and educational missionary work all over in the hinterland, and traveled thoroughly through the coastal and near interior. He built Cuttington College, the Julius C. Emery School, and countless other schools in local villages. They don't even know how many schools he opened exactly. But, every village that when he would teach people, he would have them go back to where they came from and open more schools, or he would send them to other places where they would open schools. So as the indigenous people would become educated, most of them were being educated to either be nurses or teachers. Those are the two things. You either become a medical professional, or you become an educator, or a theologist, right? So those are three real roads that they would take. So many of the teachers and subsequent bishops and school leaders were from the indigenous populations. We can go to the next slide. We've got Angie Brooks. Native people did not attend school. One of the most successful, most educated, the first woman in Liberia to have ever been appointed as the
UN.
not just the UN, but also as the basically the Minister of Justice, that could be whatever it was called at the time. I'm sorry, I'm sleepy. Angie Brooks was a lawyer. She also went to school in the United States. She was extremely, extremely brilliant. And she was born in Virginia. She was mostly Gola. Her ethnic group would be Gola, and possibly Madingo and Vai. But she was a full-blooded indigenous woman. And this idea that we have that if somebody has a Western name, they're no longer native is just absurd. But I just want to point this out that there was no woman in Liberia that was her equal when it came to education in her time. No woman. And most men. In fact, I would even argue, there were very few male lawyers that were as educated as Angie Brooks. And as we use the term legal luminary today to describe people that are just fresh out of school and don't really understand things. But if there ever was, if Angie Brooks, James J. Dosen, these were the luminaries of the legal world at the, in those days. So we can skip through this. I'm more concerned with people calling in. This is about her biography and her accomplishments. I can send the slide to people much later, but skip over Angie. Let's get into the next section. Sorry, Dennis. I love you, Angie Brooks, but there's a lot of information available about Angie, and then I can also send it to people if they like. But I wanted to get into this, this myth, Dennis. Let's talk about this a little bit, and we might want to do a show specifically about it, but we're going to cover it roughly. This is going back, kind of doubling back to this myth of the mulatto hegemony, but it's a little different because it focuses specifically on the presidency.
Right. Our first 4 presidents were mulatto. That we say with straight face here. My first president would be Joseph Jenkins Roberts, Stephen Allen Benson, Daniel B. Warner, James S. Payne.
James Briggs Payne. Yeah. So we had our first president was definitely the son of a white man. The stepson, he was raised by an African man. Roberts, his name comes from an African American that his mother married after he was born. But his father, biological father, was likely a Welsh person with the name Jenkins. So, but the Roberts name comes from his father, but he wasn't clearly mulatto. And Joseph Jenkins Roberts served as president 2 different times. The first time he served as president, he was clearly also, he had come from being the last ACS governor. I would say if there's any one person in the history of the slave trade, if you had to give one person credit for doing having the greatest individual effort to stomp out the transatlantic slave trade, that award should go to Joseph Jenkins Roberts. And then you've got Stephen Allen Benson, who was a full-blooded African, born free, not born into slavery, parents born free, possibly, grandparents may have been enslaved or may have been, from somewhere else. Then you've got Daniel B. Warner, whose parents were definitely recaptured Africans. He was born free. James Briggs Payne, born free. James Briggs Payne was not mulatto. I know that a lot of times when you Google him, you'll come up with a picture of one of the whitest white men, but we've been able to find so much overwhelming evidence, including his own biography. He didn't look the way that they painted him. E.J. Roy, our 5th president, first true Whig Party president. I mean, there's another myth. The true Whig Party has run the country since 1847. That's not true. The first true Whig president was E.J. Roy, president number 5. And they say that that those who know that the true Whig Party was not the only political party, they believe that the first 4 presidents who preceded E.J. Roy were all mulatto, and they were not. Clearly not. And again, you can go to the biography of the presidents that we all did on this channel and review that. And then you've got Smith, James Kirving Smith, when E.J. Roy was assassinated in a coup d'état, or after the coup d'état, he was then murdered. You have his vice president who then completed his term. You can go to the next slide. I kind of have all of that broken down. Yeah. So you've got. Go ahead.
Oh, 25 presidents.
Yes. So these are your presidents. And so James Kirving Smith, he served out the rest of E.J. Roy's term, and then President Roberts took over. And then when he was sick and almost dying, he resigned, and James Brooks Payne took over. So we talked about that in the president's biographies that we did, the presidential series. You can find out the shady details if you go back and watch those. And then you got Anthony William Gardner. All of our presidents, if you notice, they have photographs. They're all photographed. The need for us to draw them and make them look like they did not look is very strange. But Anthony William Gardner is here photographed in this picture. You've got after Gardner was sick, he probably had a stroke, because Gardner became very ill after he lost the Liberian territory to Britain. He fell off, which I don't know what else that would have been, but some kind of, basically died of heartache. But he got very sick and had to resign, and his vice president, Alfred Francis Russell, completed his term. So Russell was elected vice president and completed the term as president because Gardner became too ill to continue. And I must point out that it is important who people choose as vice president, because anything happens to the president, that person is president. And of course, after that, Hillary R.W. Johnson, Richard Wright Johnson, becomes president. He was the son of the late great Elijah Johnson. He was followed by Joseph James Cheeseman. So Elijah Johnson's son was not mulatto. James J. Cheeseman was not mulatto. I mean, none of the presidents after Russell was mulatto. So you have Joseph Jenkins Roberts, Alfred Francis Russell. The rest of these people had Black parents. You've got Cheeseman. Coleman was born into slavery. So you have Russell, who was the 10th president, who was the first president to be born into slavery. And then you have Coleman, who was the 13th president, who was the only other president to have been born into slavery. So I guess that debunks another myth that all of the early presidents were born slaves. They were not. It was only the 10th president and the 13th president who were born into slavery.
And because we say that, we call the people that came to Liberia, most of the time we say free slaves, right? That they were slaves.
I don't think we say free slaves. I think they're saying freed with a D, as in emancipated slaves.
Right.
Like people who were formerly enslaved. That's what that means.
Right. That's what it means, right? But some of those, as we also learned in History Channel, were born free, right?
Yes. Oh, I see what you're saying. Yes. They were so we've had two presidents that were born into slavery. Both of those presidents who were born into slavery were from the state of Kentucky, and they were liberated and sent to Liberia as children. The rest of our presidents were not born in captivity.
Exactly. But we call everybody freed slaves as if all of them were born into slavery and got free.
Right. That's a good point. That's another thing that should be debunked as well. So much stuff to debunk, Dennis. So, and then, so we emphasize Coleman, and then of course, Garrison Wilmot Gibson, and Walter Gibson. I said Wilmot, it was Walter. We had a long debate about that. So go back and watch his biography on this channel. Very interesting. And then one of my very favorite presidents, Arthur Barkley. So Arthur Barkley, 1904 to 1912, born in Barbados. He is the first president of the Republic of Liberia that was not a descendant of people born in the United States of America. He was born in Barbados, and he was a descendant of Dahomey and people from Dahomey, which is modern day Benin. And then you've got, he had a vice president. He was the one who took, so for the first time in the history of Liberia, you have, in the year 1904, both the president and the vice president were not African-American descendants. And that was Arthur Barclay and his vice president, who was an indigenous person, James J. Dosen. Then you've got the Bassa president, Daniel Howard, also not descendant of African Americans. You've got Charles D.B. King, who was the descendant of recaptured Africans, also not African Americans. So you've got and then you've got another person who was not the descendant of African Americans, which was Edwin Barclay, the nephew of Arthur Barclay, who was Chattel, because his father legitimized him. His father was a black man. His mother was a black woman. He was not mulatto. And then you have African Americans back at the realm with President Tubman, whose mother was born in Georgia, and his father was a descendant of enslaved people. And Talbert, not a mulatto. Samuel Doe, not a mulatto. Charles Taylor Jatto, Gola Man. He was not, of course, mulatto. And Moses Blah, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, and now 2018 to present, George Manalia.
So, Carl, as we'll see later, the whole idea that the first 4 presidents were mulatto came from pictures that we saw in books.
Yes. Yes, this is correct. So this picture on the left is the actual photograph on a tin plate of Stephen Allen Benson. The photo on the right is an artist's restoration of the photo on the left. Because a lot of times when we see these pictures, we're like, oh, this is exactly what he looked like. It's not exactly, the photo on the right is not exactly what he looked like. I see so many discrepancies from the two. They did a pretty good job, but I think they made his chin a little too broad. I think his face was a little more narrow. And Stephen Allen Benson's photo on the left, of course, because it's a very old tin plate, moisture, time, age has distorted it a bit. But in the center of it, you can still see his image very, very well. And you can clearly see that this man's hair was just like Dennis Jah's hair. Skin was just like Dennis Jah's skin. So this is our second president. This is an actual photograph of him on the left. And then the one on the right is, both of these are at the Library of Congress. The one on the right is a restoration, an attempt at restoring the one on the left. Now, these photographs, again, it's the same thing as before. The one on the left is actually a very good preserved image. The one on the right is kind of digitally remastered, so it's more clear. Right. Now, I can clearly see this is also Stephen Allen Benson, but they have this as an unidentified Liberian. Though the previous picture was already positively ID'd as Stephen Allen Benson, they say this one is unidentified, but it's obviously the same person. So somebody was just being lazy. If you go back one click, Dennis, and look at the picture that hasn't been corrected and compare that to the other two, this is also clearly Stephen Allen Benson.
Correct.
Now, Augustus Washington was a daguerreotypist, which is a type of photography from the 1800s where they would print these, instead of on paper, they would put it on tin or copper plates. So these are actually preserved for much longer than regular photographs. It's much easier to preserve. Very difficult to make, but this is what Stephen Allen Benson looked like. He resembled Dennis Jah much more than he did Joseph Jenkins Roberts.
That's why Ever say forehead is like mine too. So you and Ever.
Forehead. Well, they say he got four. Jenna yourself. Well, I got Elvis funny. Oh my gosh. And so,
yeah, bringing the two photos together, the
yes,
unidentified one, or so-called unidentified one, and this one.
Which is, so the one on the right, again, positively ID'd as Stephen Allen Benson because it was marked on there that it was Stephen Allen Benson. And the one on the left is saying, oh, we don't know who this guy is. It's unidentified. You know, we don't want to say Stephen Allen Benson for they accuse us of saying all the Negroes look alike. You know, so we'll just say clearly it's Benson. That's President Benson as a younger man. And thank goodness Augustus Washington took these people's photos. The next one, this is just going through really quickly. Here's President Daniel Bashir Warner, that they obnoxiously in the 20th century describe as a mulatto because they just want to believe that everybody before Roy was a mulatto. But if you read what they wrote about him when he was alive, he is described as a full-blooded African. If you watch his biography, his parents were wards of the church because they were liberated from a slave ship. His parents were born in Africa. He was born in the United States, went to Liberia as a child. It's one of those repatriated to Liberia. Now, this is the picture on the left is how he was depicted when he was alive. Not even just when he was alive, how he was depicted when he was president. And the picture on the right is supposedly an unidentified Liberian man. So again, you look at President Warner, you look at this unidentified Liberian man, you're like, wait, why is he unidentified? It's clearly, look at the man's eyes and the way that one of his eyes is a little bit up and the other one down. His nose, his lips. It is clearly Warner younger when Augustus Washington took the daguerreotype of him, and on the left while he was president. So this is an aged version of him while he was president. The one on the left, clearly the Library of Congress needs to correct this. This is clearly President Warner, the third president of Liberia. And when we do this short documentary that Dennis and I plan to do, I'm going to explain how I even got this to be proven by sending this to a forensic specialist to prove that these are the same two people. Did the same thing with James Briggs Payne, and so on and so forth. So again, the way we figured out, this was a clue that AMA Cassell and Say and myself were digging through archival records, and then we saw this image of James Briggs Payne. When we're trying to do the research for Payne's biography for this program, we came across this Harper's Weekly image of Payne. I said, but why is he so black? I thought Payne looked like a white guy, right? And we panicked. We're like, what is going on? And so we started doing more digging, got his biography. I said, no, this isn't right. And then we were able to actually find his photograph as well, which is on the list of presidents. But this is not a joke. This was intentional. Whitening these presidents was intentional disinformation to try to promote and uphold a narrative to make people believe that there was this division among people and that the people who were great had white fathers, and attribute all of these brilliant early leaders to their non-existent white fathers when these men were clearly black men. I mean, what they did to Payne is just disgusting. I mean, look at the hair texture. The skin color wasn't bad enough, but they literally made his hair look like a Scandinavian person's hair.
Okay.
I mean, that's just disrespectful. That's just disrespectful.
The picture on the left is 1868, and the one on the right is almost 100 years later.
Yeah, long after he was dead. We'll say this, there was a joke going around on social media that would go take, pictures and say, I'm going to tell my kids this was so-and-so, They were doing this to us back in the 1950s. I'm going to tell my kids this was James Briggs Spain. I'll tell your kids this was James Briggs Spain. So that it's unfortunate. It really isn't funny, but sometimes we laugh to keep ourselves from crying. It's one of the most disrespectful things you can do to people who overcome great oppression and racism, and you take them and you erase their likeness and replace it with something that they were not. I mean, that is like lynching a person in their grave. They even did it to presidents that people who are living today knew, that were living in our lifetimes knew. They did it to Daniel Howard. This is what the people said Daniel Howard looked like. This is an official government publication. And these images of these people were done by the U.S. government through USAID. There was a curator from the Smithsonian who put all of these whitewashed presidential pictures together. This is what we always do. We always bring these European and mostly these days American consultants to come in and do things for us. Well, this is what they do. This is what happens when you give other people who don't like you, people who in the 1950s, there was Jim Crow and segregation in the United States. Black children couldn't go to school with white children. Then you invite these people in your country to do a presidential series for you. What do you think they will do? In America in the 1950s, you couldn't sit in a classroom with white students, but you can invite white people into your black country to do portraits of your presidents for your children to look at. What do you think they will do? I mean, it's just ridiculous.
Yeah.
Even Willow, when he went to Harvard, we like to brag. Oh, we had a crew man that went to Harvard. It was, he sat in the hallway. They didn't even let a brother into the classroom. He could not sit at a desk in the classroom that white children use. Willow went to Harvard, spying from the hallway, and was able to do the work and graduate. Imagine that humiliation. He sat in the hallway while the other students were in the classroom. He had to spy through the door. That's how he attended Harvard. I'm sorry, Harvard. Howard, he would have been in the classroom with everybody else. This is why, this is what was happening in America, and this is just what they did. But what did Daniel Howard actually look like? Next slide, please. So this is what our Basa president actually looked like.
Handsome guy.
Yeah. So and if you go back one, Dennis, you can see the mulatto picture, the picture where they made Howard look like he was white, and compare it to the one on the right on the next slide. It's like they copied his actual photograph and just decided to make him look like a white man or a mulatto man. Because the pose is the same way.
Right, and even the clothes, the tie, the suit, right?
Yeah. It was intentional. So they look at a man picture and say, you know what, his hair too nappy. So if we make him look mulatto, they won't know he was a Basa man. Because while he was alive, everybody knew he was Basa. But if he looked like this, not that we don't have mulatto Basa people on the coast even before ACS arrived, because we did. But clearly, Daniel Howard was not mulatto. And then you've got, of course, G.W. Gibson. They whitewashed him too, but I just wanted to show what President Gibson looked like. So that's the end of my presentation. Sorry for rushing through it, but I just wanted us to kind of really understand the effort, the tremendous effort that went towards erasing the likeness, the true identity of these people.
And I want to bring in callers now or tell them to call. But the question I want you to address, why we put the numbers on the screen, is why?
Mm-hmm.
Why?
We talk about this a lot, right? So this is after colonialism. This is, during the colonial period, and Africans have been colonized by the 1950s. Colonialism had been going on since the 1880s, right? So you've got 70 years of Africans saying, what the hell are y'all doing? Give us back our land, give us back our country. and they would say, "You're not able to govern yourselves. You're going to fail." And they said, "That's not true." I mean, look at Liberia. Liberia was able to maintain her independence and defeat Europeans in court, defeat Europeans on the battlefield. Liberia was able to maintain her independence. Oh, no, 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 you're not like the Liberians. The Liberians are not Africans like you. They're the sons of white men. They were all mulattoes. Look at Ethiopia. Well, Ethiopia, you're not like them. Ethiopians are white Africans. They're ruling over the black Ethiopians. You're not like them. It was because they needed to perpetuate this narrative, this false, very false, but well accepted narrative of white supremacy. That there's a totem pole of human beings, a hierarchy of human beings, and that the lightest Europeans are at the top, and the blackest Africans are at the bottom, and all other people in the human family fall in between. And the closer you are to the European, the more intelligent you are, blah, 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 blah. Well, clearly that's not true. I mean, we had Stephen Allen Benson, who was a U.S. trained doctor, went to medical school, returned to Liberia and became president. You had Daniel Bashir Warner, who was an absolute genius, actually. You had Payne, who was a reverend. You had Roberts, who was a very brilliant general, a very brilliant leader, an emancipator, an abolitionist. You've got so much greatness. Dawson, Howard. You cannot perpetuate a narrative of a hierarchy or divisiveness if you accept or teach that Daniel Howard was not only was he black, but he was Bassa. And you can't say that, oh, Native people never had any power. They couldn't be president. They couldn't be leaders. And you've got Dawson. You got people who say they brought liberation theology to Liberia in the 1970s. When you got Bishop Ferguson and Bishop Turner and Lot Carey. Can you imagine? People who were born in the 20th century saying that they brought liberation theology to Liberia because they don't know better. They don't know better. And just because you don't know something doesn't mean it isn't true.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you are just joining us, this is the Liberia History Channel. We are discussing debunking the misinformation, disinformation, falsehood, and outright lies in Liberian history. Presenter is called Fahnbulleh. If you want to be a part of this discussion, please call the number on your screen, 605-313-6004. The code is 791-403#. And sometimes when something happens, called, do we draw some parallels to today as to how these things happened before, and are there some semblance of those kind of things today that you can point out and say, oh yeah, I think this really happened?
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, we're talking about the coloration now. People want to paint these pictures white to prove to themselves that the Africans or these people are not able to govern themselves. The lighter they are, the better. So do we see something like that today?
I mean, we see that with Arabs trying to claim ancient civilizations that existed before they invaded, right? They do that a lot. They did that in ancient Egypt to try to say, oh, the Egyptians were Arabs. They were not Arabs. It's documented when the Arabs invaded Egypt. The Arabs themselves can read and write. They documented what they saw when they went there. But their descendants are so hell-bent on erasing the Africanness of ancient Egypt. It's the same thing. It's the same thing that happened in Great Zimbabwe with the wall. The Boers get there and they don't want to admit that there were any people existing in South Africa before they arrived. So they had to claim that some Europeans built these walls, these impenetrable walls that, they couldn't explain. If the land was empty, how did...
And they can unmute themselves.
If the land was empty, how did the walls get there?
Yeah.
If the land was empty, how did the walls get there? And do we have a call holding?
Yeah, we have a caller on the line.
Okay.
And you can maybe 99% guess who that is. Mr. Morris, you are live. Go ahead, sir.
I was gonna say it'll make it sound like okay, Elvis, yeah, what's up? He's always the first caller.
Yeah. Hello to this call and thank you for the presentation. Well, Mr. Dennis, I'm serious. That man looked like you. The man got a sneak on the forehead, yes. Maybe he was a smart man like you. Had big brain.
But you guys got to petition me now so I can run.
I wanted to say, she answered a couple of questions for me today, and it gave me a little bit of relief because my understanding or my assumption was that maybe it was the government at the time that commissioned these portraits, and they themselves, was trying to perpetrate or portray these people as being mulatto or light skinned. But like Ms. Fahnbulleh said, these are people who were perhaps consultants from the United States who then, based on white supremacy, try to portray these people as, mulatto or, having some white ancestry. But then also my question would be, do we have or did we have...
Hold on. And that happened 100 years later when they were all dead. They started painting them. Yeah, go ahead.
And that's the point I'm trying to get to. So did we not have a historical library like we have here in the United States, the Library of Congress, or presidential library? I know usually presidents will build their own library or whatever. But did we not have a historical library or a record-keeping, facility where our current presidents or our current administration could go back in history and look at these people, whether it was the papers or the photos or things like that? Is that why they had to commission people from like the United States or Europeans to come and paint the portraits of our former presidents, which led to the misconceptions that we have today? That would be my question. Maybe you can touch on that, and I'll listen up line.
That's a very good question, Elvis.
Especially when you have University of Liberia, right? At least.
Right. So one of the things that I Jabari and myself on the show, Basa Bari and I always say, we have this phrase we call the buck breaking of Liberia. It began really with the King administration. Charles E.B. King took over. We then started inviting many, many foreigners because they had economically starved Liberia to the extent Liberia is the first recorded victim of a global trade embargo, beginning with the partitioning of Africa. When they couldn't take the territory from Liberia, they put a trade embargo on the country, crippling it. So what ends up happening is Liberians mostly being, the leadership of Liberia being mostly Christians, they start reaching out to churches, where prior to this era of the early 20th century, the missionaries were predominantly African Americans. 20th century, the missionaries, the educators, the people who are pushing the narrative and controlling everything are increasingly, because now there's not a lot of people African Americans trying to volunteer to go to Liberia because it's being economically starved. So when you're starving or you're drowning and somebody throws you a stick, you're going to hold on to it because there's nothing else. That's when they start introducing all of these Southern Jim Crow people in missionaries from places like Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, start going to Liberia and taking over many of the things that were previously controlled. You have the University of Liberia had died for a while, being brought back by philanthropy. And they start taking over the control of information. This is not an accident. It was intentional. It was, I say this without any regret, without a pause. It was an act of war. Disinformation is an act of war. And they come in and they start controlling the narrative. They start now creating the curriculum. They bring academic hit people in, like Doris Banks Henry. People think Doris Banks was Liberian. Well, she became Liberian, but she was African American. And not just African American, she worked for the US government. Start bringing these people in. You've got, in the early 1900s, Sir Harry Hamilton Johnston comes in from Germany. He's writing trash, voluminous trash. While there is some value to his volume of work as far as pictorial, the narrative is extremely racist, skewed, and often false. And what happens? Because he writes this voluminous book, Most people use Harry Hamilton Johnson's work as a frame of reference. He's the first person that I've ever seen document that Daniel Bashir Warner was mulatto, though everyone before him said absolutely nothing like that. Warner was always described as an African, pure-blooded Negro, tall and dark. Harry Hamilton Johnson comes in and is like, oh, Warner's a mulatto. These things are not accidental. He wasn't stupid. Warner had only been dead for 20-something years when he wrote this book. It was deliberate. He wasn't writing it for himself. He was writing it for you and I, for generations to come. It was to erase the defiant Black people who refused to give up their sovereignty. It was not an accident. This was intentional. This was intentional.
Thank you. Let me see if we have another caller. Callers, please call and call. Or because of this show, because of what the facts, especially on this particular topic, I'm thinking about the word information has an information minister or information ministry, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in Liberia, unfortunately, we are looking at information has, being government mouthpiece, right? And I'm
Right.
not trying to be political here. This dictionary say information means facts about a situation, person, or event. So unfortunately, information in Liberia is, what government does or how you can spin things around to promote government. But information should be what we are doing here. So why not really think about the information ministry of presenting facts about, example, Liberia? How can we live in a country and we don't even know that our president, how they look like for so many years, and nobody can correct that information? How can we be in a country where we are thinking the ship Elizabeth, the Mayflower, landed in Liberia, and we are able to have a bicentennial program where we have a picture of a big ship, the Elizabeth, on Providence Island. Yet in that country, we have an information ministry, a ministry that's supposed to present facts about the country. So maybe it's time to think about the information ministry another way, especially if you know a little bit of IT, where you talk about information. You talk about data, and you put the data together. You have information, you have facts, and now we are in Liberia. We are looking at information as propaganda.
Yeah.
It's sad.
It's sad. Things fall apart.
Yeah.
And that's, this isn't an accident to take a situation of excellence. Liberia, what happened in Liberia is analogous to what happened, those of you who are familiar with Black Wall Street, where all the little successful Black towns. There's a Black town just down the road from me. It's a lake now. They call it Lake Lanier. Google this. And it was a successful, prosperous Black town. I think, Dennis, you live not too far from Lake Lanier.
Yeah.
They buried the whole town underwater. They didn't have to put the lake reservoir there. They did it because they wanted to destroy this. And Liberia is the macrocosm, not micro, but macrocosm of what happened to Black Wall Street, except it happened on the continent of Africa, which is destroy it, erase it. Tell their children there's nothing to see here. Don't look back into your history. There's nothing to see. Replace the truth with a buffoonish narrative, a buffoonish and divisive, really, really stupid narrative. You really give it any thought, you realize how incredibly stupid it is.
Yeah.
But when it's all you have, you just accept it because there's no alternative view or no alternative way to look at the past. And then it becomes an established reality for people. And for example, if I hadn't seen evidence that James Briggs Payne didn't look like a Scandinavian, I would have never had any reason to believe he didn't. As much as I've been studying and researching Literally, I found out that James Briggs Payne did not look like that when I was preparing and doing research to present about him. Stumbled across a article in Harper's Weekly from the year he was elected to office, and they portrayed him as very black with kinky hair. And I said, what's going on? Did they do to this man what they did to others? And yes, of course they did. I was able to go and dig and say, oh my God, even Brother Payne, they did this too. They were doing this up until the 1950s, or erasing people like Daniel Howard, people that people saw. E.J. Roy, that everyone accepts as a black man, on our currency looks like a Spaniard.
Yeah.
That's not an accident. And Elvis's question is brilliant, because Elvis said, well, I always thought the government did it. In a sense, the government did do it because they didn't know better. They outsourced their responsibility to people that they thought were better than them. They had already been broken, their spirits broken. They don't know anything about their past. They had been educated by these Southern missionaries who've taught them everything. You're dumb, and the only reason you're worth anything at all is because your ancestors came from America and they taught you to speak and stand upright. And so you're better than your indigenous brothers. In fact, they're not your brothers. They're savages.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is what they were taught. And that isn't what they came back with. That's what they were taught. That's how they were broken. You still to this day hear the descendants of people like Elijah Johnson saying things that have their ancestors turning over in their graves.
Yeah. And just for those of us, and we have one more caller, say those of us who, I enter the University of Liberia before the war. But there are people who just believe because they look at today and think that there was nothing there. They wouldn't know that before the war, as a high school students in the 12th grade, I was on TV representing a quizzing competition on TV.
Yeah.
There are a lot of people, and we are gathering around and we are having these debate shows and things like that with people like Wade Kuba had a program called Education Searchlight, and they will call high school students and they will deliberate like university students. These things happen. But now, if you ask someone who is maybe 30 years old, they just think that nothing was ever there. Let's take Madison Camus. Madison, you are live, and we have one more, but let's get Madison first.
Hey, how you doing there, my people?
Great.
Good. This call, thank you again for the program, very educational. I just want to pick up on the last 2 points that Mr. Dennis made. I remember when I was in Liberia.
Hold on, Madison. There's a feedback there. Are you watching the show on any device? We can turn it off.
No, sorry for that. I'm at work.
Okay, go ahead quickly.
Like that, I think I got to drop it.
Okay.
Yeah, let me just say, I remember back then when I grew up, we were taught about other African countries' history. We could memorize Asia, Mali, Ghana, Tonga, but our own history would be nothing about it. It was at a university that I got to go. The true identity of Martina Nipo, when I was reading Liberian history. So all along the line, Liberian history has been taught to its, factual foundation. They are all been worldwide, like what they call it. And the sad thing about it is that even those who are educating our society, they sit in the country without even coming on a program or any other thing to debunk these things. So it's just heartbreaking, You sit down, more about Ghana history, Nigeria, the first person, the question we used to bring cameras just to learn about the entire Africa, but our own country, we barely know anything about it.
Yeah, it's deliberate. It's not an accident. It's not an accident.
Thank you. Let me take our last caller here. Your name and where you're calling from, 856 area code.
My name is James.
James?
Yes, how are you?
I'm doing wonderful. Thanks for calling.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for the show, and thanks to my Fahnbulleh. Ms. Fahnbulleh, I have a question for you. I mean, I admire your presentation, but don't you find it rather difficult to understand that people that fought so hard for the province over the years will then come into the 20th century. And in the 20th century, we have all of this disinformation within our stream, within our societal stream. And with all of the intellectuals and the historians we have, even in Liberia at the time, nobody had the tenacity to dig into our historical context, to be able to uncover these things that will impact our social status. Don't you find that troubling?
Thank
Well, I
you.
think it's an assumption. I don't know if that is a true assumption. You say nobody. Because it's not like I went and dug under a grave to find information. I mean, this is information that's, in archives and libraries all over the place. Why do you believe that nobody has that nobody else knows this?
Well, because I know that when I was in school, the history book that I had, it told me that John Kizell was an African. His father was a King. Kizell was taken to a war. After the war, Kizell came back to Africa. There was no context for that story.
Right.
And even though I was being taught that, you would think that another teacher, or some teacher that had any kind of exposure to history, will have questioned the validity of that material being taught to young students in Liberia. But I never.
I see what you're saying. I understand what you're saying.
Right.
So there's two different things. The first thing is there's people who control the curriculum and control information and control what's being taught to children. And as I said, from the early 20th century, that has really been in the hands of European Americans mostly. Our curriculum, what we're taught, how we're taught, has been really intentionally guided and controlled very tightly by people who present. So this all comes with Firestone and economic annexation. They could not allow another Arthur Barclay. They could not allow any more of these people to come up in Liberia. They had to make sure that they tailored the curriculum to produce citizens that they needed them to be. Not the citizens that are going to liberate Liberia so Liberia could use its own resources for the benefit of its own people, but citizens that were going to be suffering from identity complexes and low self-esteem. Education was the tool, the mechanism that they used, almost like a form of warfare, to make sure that we stayed in our place. So, for example, we're having this discussion now. It is not the education ministry having this discussion because we don't fund the education ministry. The US government does. Even the tax dollars, you see how much goes to the education ministry? It's not enough to create a curriculum. That's not an accident. But all of the money that USAID pumps into Liberia, it's not to correct this because it won't benefit any other country to correct this. So if we want the curriculum to be corrected, it has to be done by ourselves. I don't find that peculiar at all. The reason it's the way it is because of the people who are controlling the process. And we gladly allow them to do it because they give us resources. And you think it's an accident that our teachers look when this guy, and I'm not a fan of the former Minister of Education. I think for many reasons, with the More Than Me scandal and so many other things, that George Warner is not a good person. He was not a good Minister of Education. I'll say that publicly any day, anywhere. But you think it's an accident that he went and got some former crackhead to go be, get government resources and open a school called More Than Me, running around having rape dens with our children? You think that's an accident? You think that's the first time that's happened? They've been doing that to us and our kids. Bringing these whacked out people into Liberia to control education. You've got Brenda Brewer, that brilliant, that could do so much more. Are we supporting them? You know, when this girl, when they found out that she and her boyfriend were raping children, what did Liberian people do? Well, at least you were trying to do something.
Yeah.
Defending a rapist of children, an exploiter of children.
Some
So this is we're used
argue
to it.
that, hey, those children were not virgin anyway. That's why
Can you
some
imagine? Henry Costa said that. Henry Costa said that on his show. And people are taking this man seriously. This is a person Liberian people take seriously. That said our victimized children, well, they were already victimized before, so who cares? He defended a person who exploited Liberian children, and we take him seriously in the political sphere. This is the kind of country we come from. So just don't be surprised. That's what miseducation does to people. It breaks their self-esteem. They lose their dignity, their self-respect. They join the ranks of their enemies and bear arms against themselves. When you're educated and miseducated this way, that's what happens. So we don't control the curriculum. And I don't think I'm the only person that has found this information. A lot of the stuff that I talk about, I've also read in secondary sources. Like, you know, Patrick Burrows is clear on most of this stuff. So it's not that I'm the only person, it's that who has the power to put this into academia and make sure that the children are learning this.
It's true. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, James.
Appreciate the question, James. This is really thought-provoking.
Right. So Carl, let's wrap up. But I want you to, as we wrap up, I want you to also talk about, because this misinformation, this information, outright lies must be fought, must be defeated, and we are doing one tonight, right?
Yes.
We're also doing something about this. That Save the State partnering with BIAO, and you are doing
Yes.
something like, I was fortunate to attend at least during work to attend at least few minutes of that class. Let's talk a little bit about that as we close, because we, someone when we're doing it, say, somebody will come and say, hey, why don't you write a book or why don't you read it? But each of us in a very small way can fight this so
Yes.
that we get educated. Let's talk about the little that you and your group are
Yeah, so
doing.
Save the State and BAIO have partnered to create a nonprofit organization called the Liberia Legacy Foundation. And the Liberia Legacy Foundation is there to preserve history, culture, and to promote education, ethics, and good governance and leadership in Liberia. So one of the things that we've done is we've come up with a mentorship program. We hired 3 young Liberians, Paul, Lovely, and Morrison, to mentor them. We're going to teach them and train them, and they're going to be facilitators for young people in the future. And when I say young people, I mean actual children, middle school age, so from 12 to 15 years old will be the age range that we're going to target for our leadership and mentorship program. The class that Dennis attended was part of the Train the Trainers class. So we're going to be working with these young people over a period of 6 months, and we are going to teach them things that we think that they ought to know and be prepared to stand in front of young people and to be able to mentor them as well. One of the main principles is ethics. People talk about anti-corruption all the time, but they don't really teach it. They don't really teach ethics. They don't really teach anti-corruption. They don't really teach these things. And so kids get confused with the messaging. So we focus on that. Of course, history, civics. So ethics, civics, history, leadership, we are doing extremely, extremely well. The young people are so smart. They just need positive mentorship. And one of the things that we have thoroughly erased from our mentees is this concept of tribal bigotry. And if we can succeed in doing that with more people, I think those are the small steps that we need to be taking to move forward. But and you erase those things by telling young people the truth. So thanks for bringing that up, Dennis, and giving me an opportunity to plug this. As this program grows, right now it's self-sponsored, meaning it's just the members of the organization. We just reach into our pockets and we sponsor it ourselves. But as it grows, and once we get our facilitators trained and we open up the mentorship training program, we will be depending on our fellow citizens to help us with resources so we can grow the project. Right now, we're still building it, but it's very fulfilling, and the impact we're having is for me, it's shocking. I didn't even realize how hungry our young people were for knowledge and really wanting to respect their country and where they come from, and they were ready to hear this information and ready to hear the message.
Thank you. Thank
You're
you so
welcome.
much, Carl, for tonight. I want to thank
Yeah.
our viewers, those who call in, those who I know we didn't go through all the comments, but thank you so much for always watching Focus on Liberia, the Liberia History Channel, and supporting us. There are lots and lots of ways that we need help. Sometimes people call me and say, "Are you coming on tonight?" And to be honest with you, I'm very transparent. Sometimes we don't have the capacity, we don't have the physical strength to continue anymore, right? So, like most of us, we work 9 to 5. So after 9 o'clock, you have a show, and that is running to, today, right after work, we had the first show on health. These are all educational show, and now we're having the History Channel, all to give back, right? And we need all the support that we can. We need human beings to come volunteer to help. We need money. We need encouragement. We need people to connect us with radio station, because these things that we are teaching, they are not political. We are not supporting political parties. Because right now, if we were promoting one party to be, the Hosanna, heaven is coming down when this person becomes president, that particular political person will support this. Will some politician even promised to build us an entire radio station in Liberia. If we can go on and just support them like headless chickens, telling them yes. And so, if you want this kind of information and you interested in the enlightenment we have signed up for, please join us in this effort. Give us a call and we'll tell you how. Thank you so much for always watching. Call your final thoughts and then we close the broadcast.
So there's going to be more. The next episode that Dennis will announce the day and time. The next episode of the Liberian History Channel is going to cover this myth of migration. So I spent most of my life believing that everybody migrated here. And what does that actually mean? Are we talking about archaic human migration? The out of Africa migration that created Europeans and Asians and Americans. If that's the context, then yes, everyone is a foreigner. There's no indigenous people anywhere. But if we're talking about in the languages and cultures that evolved in a place, that are so old to a place that they're only unique to that place, then Liberia has indigenous people. And there are groups that actually, in that context, did not migrate. And so we're going to explore what that means. And why it's important to tell the truth about that, and why is it, of all the continents in Africa, there's only two places that, and this is very sad, there's only two countries in Africa that claim that everybody migrated there, and that's South Africa and Liberia. And I don't think that the people who created the republic thought that. It's their descendants, their miseducated descendants, that think that it's important to mimic the bigotry of South Africans and erase indigenous people in order to justify something they don't need to justify. We're all Africans. You're Black, your ancestors knew they were descendants of Africa and returned home. So there's no reason to erase indigenous people and say that everyone migrated. It is not the truth. And I will lay that out very clearly with numerous reports. Please watch. It's going to be a fiery episode. And thanks, Dennis, for this opportunity to share what I've researched with our fellow citizens.
Thank you. And the Liberia History Channel is off this weekend, and that's one reason we are doing this during the week.
Yes.
Because we can't afford to miss an episode. So thank you again. At this time, we close with our song that says, "We are all Liberians." Have a good night. And God
Good night,
bless.
everyone. Thank you.
We are Liberians. Liberia is our home. Liberian people. Liberia.